Welcome to the Deep Dive, your shortcut to understanding those key sources you've been meaning to get to.
And today, we're diving deep into arguably the most crucial period in human history.
That's right, the global spread of Homo sapiens, how our species went from one of several hominins to, well, the only one left standing. It's a story that's chaotic, faster than we thought, and ultimately total.
It really is the story of global dominance. And understanding how sapiens pulled it off, well, that tells us a lot about everything that came after. From the first farms right up to massive states, the foundations were laid back then.
So our mission today is to unpack the evidence for that success. We're looking at archaeology, genetics, even linguistics, trying to figure out the how and the why. Why us and not, say, the Neanderthals?
And it's not about finding one single magic bullet, is it? It's more about this incredible adaptability, this kind of plasticity sapiens seem to have.
Exactly. And we're going to start with maybe the trickiest part of the whole expansion story, colonizing the Americas.
Ah, yes. The Americas. If you want a perfect example of how messy and surprising human expansion really was, this is it. It seems like every time we think we've got it figured out,
Some new discovery just blows the old theory out of the water.
precisely, it's a field in constant, well, turmoil, you could say.
Okay, so let's start with the old story. The one that was in all the textbooks for, what, decades?
The Clovis First model. Yeah, it was neat, tidy, almost elegant in its simplicity.
And it all hinged on two big geological things happening at just the right time.
That's the one. First, you needed the Bering Strait land bridge. Basically, during the Ice Age, so much water was locked up in glaciers that sea levels dropped massively, maybe 300 feet.
Which connected Siberia and Alaska.
Right.
Walkable land. Beringia.
Right. So step one, you could walk across, but then you hit the second problem.
Ice. Huge amounts of ice covering North America.
Exactly. Two massive ice sheets, the Laurentide and the Cordilleran, blocked the way south. So for the land route theory to work, you needed a gap, a path between those sheets.
And that's where the ice-free corridor comes in. That was C. Vance Haynes' work back in the 60s.
Yes, 1964. Haynes's research seemed to show that this corridor, a sort of relatively warmer channel through the ice in northwest Canada, opened up around 13,000 years ago.
And the beauty of it was the timing.
Perfect timing.
Yeah.
The idea was this combination land bridge open, corridor open only happened once in the last 20,000 years, and only for a few hundred years. And wouldn't you know it?
It lined up perfectly with the oldest widespread artifacts we knew about than the Clovis points found in New Mexico.
Exactly. Clovis culture seemed to appear right after that corridor supposedly opened, so the story wrote itself. People walked across Beringia, waited for the corridor, zipped down it, and populated the Americas. Simple. Linear.
Until it wasn't.
Yeah.
Until the discovery thousands of miles away just broke the timeline.
It really did. That neat narrative just completely came unglued in 1997. That was when the Monte Verde site in southern Chile was finally definitively accepted.
Okay, Monte Verde, southern Chile. That's, what, 7,000 miles south of Alaska?
At least. And the crucial part, the dating. Compelling evidence of people living there more than 12,000 years ago. Some dates pushed even earlier, closer to 12,500, maybe even 13,000 BP.
Right, so let's think about the logistics. If the ice-free corridor only opened around 13,000 years ago,
How on earth did people get 7,000 miles south, through completely unknown territory, establish a settlement, and leave clear evidence, potentially before the corridor was even usable, or at best, immediately after it opened?
it just doesn't work. The travel time alone.
It's impossible. Even if you grant the earliest possible opening for the corridor, the speed required is just unbelievable for hunter-gatherers moving into a new world. They must have arrived earlier.
So did the thinking then shift to, okay, maybe the corridor opened earlier than we thought?
Yeah.
Or did people start questioning the corridor itself?
Both, really. More geological work was done, and yes, some suggested maybe it could have been open a bit earlier, but critically, even if it was physically open, it was likely ecologically barren, meaning it was probably a desolate, frozen wasteland. No plants, no animals, nothing for people to eat or use on that long trek south. It might have been a path, but not a viable migration route for the first arrivals.
Wow. So the whole foundation of the Clovis First model just crumbled. I can imagine that caused a bit of a stir.
Oh, absolutely. You had archaeologists saying things like, we're in a state of turmoil. Stuart Fiedel famously said something like, everything we knew is now supposed to be wrong.
A bit dramatic maybe, but it captures the feeling.
It does. The certainty was gone. The single, simple story was replaced by, well, a lot of questions and uncertainty.
So if they didn't walk through that specific corridor at that specific time, the floodgates opened for new theories, right? When did they arrive? How did they arise?
Exactly. It became, as you said, the Wild West of migration theories. Timelines started getting pushed back way back.
How far back are we talking?
Some researchers started suggesting maybe 20,000 years ago when the ice sheets were smaller. Others pointed to, let's say, more suggestive artifacts, things that might be tools at sites like Monte Verde itself, potentially dating over 30,000 years old.
30,000. Or even older.
Some whispers go back as far as 50,000 years. It's still highly debated, of course. The evidence gets much harder to interpret that far back, but the window suddenly stretched from a few hundred years to potentially tens of millennia.
And if the land corridor wasn't the way, how did they travel?
The most logical alternative became the coastal route. The idea is they used boats, or at least watercraft, and basically hugged the Pacific coastline.
Bypassing the ice sheets entirely.
Right. The coast would have offered rich marine resources, fish, shellfish, sea mammals, and it avoids the whole ice-free corridor problem. You could move south relatively quickly along the coast long before the interior route was viable.
That makes the Monte Verde date seem much less problematic, doesn't it?
Definitely. It's become a leading hypothesis. But, when the old theory collapsed, all sorts of ideas emerged.
Like what? More out there stuff?
Oh, yeah. People speculated about transatlantic crossings, maybe from Europe, though the evidence for that is very thin. Trans-Pacific routes. Someone even floated a theory, pretty speculatively, about coming via Australia and somehow getting past Antarctica.
Wow. Okay, that shows a certain level of desperation to find any explanation.
It shows how wide open the field became. So the current state isn't really a consensus. It's more of an agreement that it was complicated.
Multiple waves, maybe.
That's gaining a lot of traction. Many researchers now think there wasn't just one migration, but maybe several distinct waves of settlement. Some genetic and skeletal studies suggest perhaps up to 5 different waves.
Coming at different times, maybe even from slightly different places.
Potentially, with the earliest wave possibly being, like we said, as much as 50,000 years ago. Which would mean the ancestors of most modern Native Americans might actually be relatively recent arrivals compared to the very first people on the continent.
So the big takeaway here is that the Sapiens expansion wasn't some neat, orderly march. It was messy, probably involved multiple routes and timings, and started much, much earlier than we used to believe.
Exactly. It highlights this incredible adaptability right from the start. Finding ways around massive obstacles like continents of ice. That's a key Sapiens trait.
Okay, that adaptability, that behavioral plasticity, is clearly crucial for Sapiens. But to really grasp how impressive their global takeover was, we need context. We need to look at who else was around, specifically our closest relatives, the Neanderthals.
That's vital. We can't just assume Sapiens were inherently better. The sources are clear. Neanderthals weren't primitive brutes. Their way of life was a major upgrade over earlier hominins.
An amplification and enhancement, as one source puts it. They were highly sophisticated in their own right.
Absolutely. If we want to understand what advantages Sapiens might have had, we first need to appreciate just how high the Neanderthal bar was set. We need to see them as a successful, well-adapted species, not just a failed side branch.
And technologically, particularly with stone tools, they were incredibly skilled. We're talking level law techniques, discoid technology. This wasn't just banging rocks together.
Not at all. It was strategic, efficient. The discoid technique especially is described as a masterclass in economy, almost like having a production line.
A zero-waste system.
Mm.
How did that work? How do you get zero waste from chipping stone?
It's about the geometry, the planning. Yeah. With discoid, you prepare the core minimally. Then the way you strike it means almost every flake that comes off is usable either as a finished tool or ready for minor retouching.
Okay.
And the clever part is, each time you remove a flake, it sets up the perfect surface, the perfect angle for the next strike. You don't need to stop, rotate the core constantly, reshape it. You can just keep striking flake after flake.
So it's fast, and you get more usable pieces from the same lump of rock.
Exactly. Maximum efficiency from the raw material.
Yeah.
And they could get different shapes out of this process, too. Points, blades, scrapers. Often, these flakes came off with a naturally thick, blunt edge on one side.
Like a built-in handle.
Sort of, yeah. Making them easy to hold and use immediately, like a prehistoric penknife. It shows real intelligent resource management.
Okay, so sophisticated tools. What about how they lived? Social structure. Movement.
The evidence points to complex patterns there, too. We find some sites, like Abric del Pastor, that seem to be very short-term camps, minimal traces, suggesting maybe small groups on the move.
Hunter-gatherer pit stops.
Pretty much. But then you have sites like Ebrick Romani in Spain. These look much more like home bases.
What makes Abercrombie a home base? Longer occupation.
Longer, repeated occupation, yes, but also clear signs of collaboration. We find animal bones there that were clearly hunted and sometimes even partly butchered elsewhere.
And then brought back to the main site.
Exactly, brought back presumably to share, to process further. This points towards planned hunting trips, coordination, and bringing resources back to a central location for the benefit of the whole group. It's not just every individual for themselves.
And we can actually track how far they traveled for resources, right? Through the stone tools again.
We can. By analyzing the type of stone and matching it to geological sources, we can see how far they moved to get good raw material. And sometimes, these distances are really impressive.
Even compared to later sapiens groups.
In some cases, yes. The sources mention instances where Neanderthals were transporting high-quality flint further than what we often see in subsequent Upper Paleolithic sapiens contexts in the same regions.
What does that suggest about their strategy? Specialized hunting parties.
It points towards something like that, maybe similar to what we see in some Paleo-Indian groups in North America, small, mobile hunting teams going out hard and fast on long trips.
Covering dozens of miles, maybe.
Potentially. They'd make the kill, maybe take only the best bits, the meat, the fat, and bring that back, leaving the less mobile members of the group, maybe the very young, the old pregnant individuals, back at the safer home site.
Strategic division of labor, essentially.
It looks like it. They were capable of organizing themselves efficiently for survival in challenging environments.
Now, the sources get quite evocative when talking about their inner world, describing them as beings of feeling, surrounded by presences, familiar routes being like rivers of memory. How much of that is poetic license versus actual evidence?
That's a fair question. Obviously, we can't know their inner thoughts, but it's interpretive language grounded in inference. When we find evidence of Neanderthals burying their dead, sometimes with grave goods.
Or evidence of caring for the sick and injured, individuals who clearly couldn't have survived alone for years.
Right. That strongly suggests complex emotions, empathy, social bonds that go beyond pure instinct. The rivers of memory idea speaks to a deep, intimate knowledge of their territory, not just as a map of resources, but probably imbued with social meaning, history, maybe even spirituality.
So not just reacting, but reflecting, remembering, maybe even mourning.
The evidence certainly allows for that interpretation, and they definitely showed guile and courage. Think about what else lived alongside them.
Cave lions, hyenas, big, scary predators.
Exactly. And we have evidence of Neanderthals hunting and butchering these dangerous carnivores. To do that, you have to overcome a pretty strong instinctual fear. It takes planning, cooperation, nerve.
So the picture we're getting is technologically adept, socially complex, mobile, adaptable, probably emotionally rich.
They were not simple creatures. They were highly successful hominins for hundreds of thousands of years across a vast area.
Which makes the question even sharper. Why did sapiens ultimately replace them and everyone else? If Neanderthals were this capable, what was the sapiens' edge?
It likely wasn't just about being slightly smarter or having slightly better tools in a one-to-one comparison. It seems to come back to that enhanced plasticity, perhaps a greater capacity for symbolic thought and complex language, allowing for cooperation on a much, much larger scale, and maybe faster adaptation to rapidly changing climates or new environments.
So scale and speed of adaptation, maybe?
That seems to be a key part of the puzzle.
Okay, so sapiens spread across the globe, adapting to everything from icy tundras to tropical rainforests. They're the last hominins standing. What's the next huge transformation?
The big one, agriculture, the Neolithic Revolution. But the sources suggest it wasn't necessarily this brilliant invention that happened because people suddenly had loads of free time.
No. What was the driver then?
It looks like population pressure was a major factor. The data from archaeology is pretty clear on this. After the last ice age ended, around 18,000 years ago, the climate warmed up.
Better conditions, more resources.
Exactly. And in many places, hunter-gatherer populations started to grow. Campsites got more numerous, and they got bigger.
Wait, but more people, more resources. That sounds like success, doesn't it? Why would a population boom cause great stress, as the sources put it?
Because the hunter-gatherer lifestyle has limits. It relies on mobility and having enough territory per person. When population density increases, even slightly, you start running into problems.
Like using up local wild foods faster.
Yes, and needing to move more often. But if your neighbors are also growing in number, there's less empty land to move into. The traditional way of dealing with population growth, splitting off into smaller groups, Fission stops working when the landscape fills up.
Ah, okay. So the success itself creates a problem. Too many mouths, not enough readily available wild stuff, and nowhere to easily move to.
Precisely. That pressure seems to have forced their hand. To cope, to feed those extra kids, they had to find ways to get more food out of the land they did have, which meant starting to actively cultivate plants they already knew were edible.
And that leads straight into this vicious circle idea.
It does. You start cultivating plants to feed the slightly larger population. But cultivating plants, even simple gardening, allows you to support even more people in one place. It encourages settling down,
Which leads to larger families, higher population density.
which increases the need to cultivate even more intensively. It becomes a feedback loop. More food enables more people, which demands more food.
And this is where cultural evolution just takes off, racing ahead of biological evolution. We can actually see this pressure reflected in the plants themselves.
Oh, absolutely. The difference between wild plants and their domesticated cousins is often staggering. Humans started selecting, maybe not even consciously at first, for traits that were useful to them, not necessarily good for the plant in the wild.
Like what kind of traits?
Well, take grains, like wheat or barley. Wild grasses need to shatter easily when ripe, so their seeds disperse. But for a farmer, that's a disaster. You lose your harvest on the ground.
So they'd naturally favor the odd plants where the seeds didn't shatter easily, the ones that stayed on the stalk.
Exactly. They selected for non-shattering spokes. They also selected for seeds with thinner coats, so they germinate faster when planted. And for uniform ripening, you want the whole field ready to harvest at roughly the same time, not plants ripening randomly over weeks.
And over generations of this selection, the plants themselves changed dramatically.
Massively. You mentioned maize earlier. Compare modern corn to its wild ancestor, teosinte. It's almost unbelievable they're related. Teosinte is this small, grassy thing with a few hard-cased kernels. Maize, that difference is pure human-driven selection.
And this agricultural package, once developed, had huge demographic consequences, didn't it? Even if the overall global population grew slowly at first.
Globally, yeah, maybe from 4 million to 5 million people over 5,000 years doesn't sound huge. But locally, where farming took hold, population densities could skyrocket compared to hunter-gatherers.
So farmers started to outnumber hunter-gatherers.
Yes. The sources talk about Neolithic grain farmers expanding, often at the expense of non-sedentary peoples.
At the expense of, that could mean conflict or assimilation. Or maybe something else.
It could be all of the above. Direct conflict over land, certainly. Hunter-gatherers perhaps being pushed into marginal areas or maybe deciding to adopt farming themselves. Or even disease-dense farming villages could have been breeding grounds for pathogens that hunter-gatherers had no immunity to.
A demographic takeover, one way or another.
Seems like it. And this concentration of people, and critically, a storable food surplus grain, lays the groundwork for the next step.
Social hierarchy. The state.
Exactly. Those late Neolithic villages, especially the ones on really fertile land like river valleys, become the seeds for early states. Because states, especially archaic states, needed one key thing.
An appropriable surplus. Food that could be collected, stored, and controlled.
Right. You need that surplus to feed people who don't farm, the specialists. Clerks, artisans, soldiers, priests, aristocrats, as the source lists them.
The ruling class and their support network.
Pretty much. And there was a huge logistical constraint back then. Transport. Grain is heavy and bulky. You couldn't easily ship large amounts of it over long distances with just muscle power or basic carts.
So the state had to physically arise where the grain was.
Essentially, yes. You needed that concentration of fertile land, farming labor, and the resulting grain surplus, all within a relatively small radius to support the non-producing elite and the state apparatus. The state grew up around the grain silo, almost literally. #Tag4. Scientific tools for tracing kinship and divergence.
So we've got this grand narrative from archaeology, the spread, the shift to farming, the rise of states. But how do we trace the connections, the kinship between these ancient peoples? We need other tools. Let's talk about language dating glottochronology.
Glottochronology. It's a fascinating idea, developed back in the 1960s by Morris Swadesh. The goal is to put a date on when two related languages split from a common ancestor.
Like figuring out when French and Italian branched off from Latin.
Exactly that kind of thing, but trying to push it back much, much further into prehistory.
How on earth do you put a date on language change? It seems so fluid.
Well, the core idea relies on a specific list of words. Swadesh compiled a list of about 100, sometimes 200, basic vocabulary terms.
What kind of terms?
Really fundamental stuff. Body parts: ear, eye, hand. Kinship terms: mother, father. Basic natural phenomena: sun, water, stone. Verbs for basic actions: eat, drink, die, maybe even vomit. The idea is that these core concepts are universal, and the words for them should be less likely to be borrowed from other languages.
Okay, so you have this list of stable words. How does that give you a date?
Swadesh argued, and this is the controversial part, that these core words change or get replaced at a roughly constant average rate across all languages. He proposed a rate of about 14% change per 1,000 years.
14%. That seems incredibly precise
Yeah.
and universal.
That's the main criticism. You compare the lists for two related languages, see what percentage of words are still cognates, meaning they derive from the same root word in the ancestor language. Then you basically run the math backwards using that 14% decay rate to estimate how long ago they must have diverged.
So if they share, say, half the words, you calculate back
Yeah,
quite a few millennia.
something like that, yeah. But you can see the problem. Is language change really that constant? Don't things like migration, conquest, intense cultural contact, or long periods of isolation speed up or slow down change?
It feels like they obviously would. A universal clock seems unlikely.
It is unlikely, and that's the major critique from most linguists today. The rate isn't constant, it's not universal. However, it still gets used, especially for very deep time connections where other methods fail, partly because the basic intuition that core vocabulary is more stable than, say, words for technology has some truth to it, and partly, frankly, because sometimes it's the only tool available that even tries to offer a quantitative date for prehistoric language splits. It's used cautiously, let's say.
Okay, moving from words to biology. Genetic tracing, especially using mitochondrial DNA, has been huge, right? Particularly for that messy American colonization story we started with.
Immense. Mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA, has been revolutionary. The key thing about mtDNA is that it's inherited almost entirely from your mother.
It's passed down the maternal line only.
Right. It doesn't get mixed up with paternal DNA during reproduction. So any changes in it are purely due to mutation, which happens at a roughly predictable, though not perfectly constant rate over long periods. This makes it a fantastic tool for tracing direct maternal ancestry and figuring out when different lineages diverged.
So what has mtDNA told us about the first Americans?
It's shown quite clearly that the vast majority of indigenous people across North and South America belong to one of four main maternal haplogroups, basically, major branches of the mtDNA family tree. They're labeled A, B, C, and D.
Four founding lineages, essentially.
Broadly speaking, yes. Their distribution and the mutations within them strongly suggest they originated somewhere in Asia and diverged at certain points, although the exact timing of their arrival in the Americas is still debated based on genetic clocks versus archaeological dates.
But it supports the idea of a limited number of originating groups, even if the timing is complex.
It does. And then there's the intriguing fifth one.
Yes, haplogroup X, the rare one.
Very rare in the Americas, yes. But what's fascinating about X is that it's also found, much more commonly, in Europe and parts of Western Asia.
Which immediately makes you go, huh, how did a European marker get into pre-Columbian Native American populations?
Exactly. It fuels all sorts of theories. Some propose it represents a separate, perhaps earlier migration wave, maybe linked to the Solutrean hypothesis, the idea of an Atlantic crossing, though that's highly controversial.
Or maybe later contacts we don't know about.
Possibly. Or one really interesting, though speculative idea links it much later, potentially to the time of Genghis Khan.
Genghis Khan, how?
The idea is that the massive expansion and reproductive success of Khan's lineages spread certain genetic markers, including potentially subtypes of X, very widely across Eurasia in the 13th century. Could some echo of that vast demographic event have eventually, indirectly, reached the Americas much later through complex population movements across Beringia? It's a long shot, perhaps.
But it shows how huge historical events can leave these faint genetic footprints thousands of miles away, centuries later.
It does. It highlights the complexity.
And finally, back to the bones themselves. Does the physical shape, the morphology of the oldest skeletons fit this picture of multiple, maybe distinct early waves?
It really seems to. The finds from places like Lagoa Santa in southern Brazil are key here. Some of the oldest skeletons found there, dating back maybe 9,000 to 12,000 years.
They look different.
They have a different cranial shape, different facial features, what's sometimes called a Paleoamerican morphology that looks distinct from most later and modern Native American populations.
suggesting they might represent an earlier wave, maybe from a different source population, that was later largely replaced or assimilated by the ancestors of current groups.
That's one strong interpretation, yes. It adds another layer of evidence pointing away from a single, simple migration and towards a much more complex, multi-stage peopling of the continents. Hashtag tag outro.
Okay, so let's try and pull this all together. We've got sapiens spreading incredibly early, adapting rapidly, outcompeting or absorbing other hominins like the highly capable Neanderthals. Then, population pressure pushes them into farming.
Which allows for denser populations, surplus food, and eventually the complex structures of states. The common thread seems to be this precisely. Maya priests meticulously tracked the cycles of Venus, considering its appearance as the morning or evening star to be auspicious or dangerous for warfare. The big attack, the Star Wars event, as archaeologists nicknamed it, happened on April 29th, 562 AD, timed according to those celestial omens.
That level of coordination, military, political, religious, astronomical, all working together towards a single strategic goal over years.
It's a direct descendant of that fundamental sapiens' ability to share complex plans, build shared beliefs, and organize large numbers of people that allowed us to spread across the world in the first place.
It's an amazing trajectory. But it leaves me with a kind of provocative thought to end on. We've seen how population pressure, that stress of having more mouths to feed, seems to have been a key driver forcing the shift to agriculture. Maybe not some genius invention, but a coping mechanism.
The vicious circle creating its own necessity.
Right. So, should we maybe look at our current situation, a huge global population, constant pressure for technological fixes, resource depletion, environmental stress, not just as progress, but as the same fundamental vicious circle stress playing out on a planetary scale? Are we constantly just solving the problems created by our own relentless demographic and adaptive success?
That's a sobering thought. Are we still caught in that same loop, just with higher stakes? Something definitely for you, our listeners, to think about.
Indeed. We'll leave you with that thought until our next deep dive.